fucking kill it! Yes! Fuck yeah!
Ultimates, the highest level of difficulty in Final Fantasy XIV, bestowing unique titles and glamours available only to those who have proven themselves worthy. Although common strats for each ultimate now exist, and it's not entirely uncommon to find players with legend tags and savage reclear / past party finders, the world first race to clear an ultimate is always a bitter fight. Hundreds of teams across the globe probing for hours on end spread across multiple days, coming up with new strats and optimization in real time, all for the title of World First. Let's rewind for a bit and take a look at Final Fantasy XIV's Ultimate World First races. The unending coil of Bahamut, otherwise known as UCOB, was introduced in patch 4.11 during Stormblood, boasting a new level of difficulty never seen prior that would challenge even the world's best raiders. This fight consists of 5 phases: Twintania, Niel, Bahamut Prime, the Ads phase, and finally Golden Bahamut, with the whole overall package lasting for about 18 to 20 minutes. The world first clear was done 11 days after release by an unnamed Japanese group on the 4th of November 2016. Although the group did not have an official name, there were definitely notable players in the party, namely those which were part of Team Lucrezia, who was the team that held the world's first for both Turn 4 of the second coil of Bahamut Savage and the final coil of Bahamut. Upon hearing the clear time, you might be thinking that 11 days is pretty long for a first clear. And while you'd be right, it did take longer than the other ultimates, you also have to keep in mind that this is the very first ultimate to come out. Players had no idea what to expect in terms of difficulty and mechanics. For example, during Niel's phase, there is a mechanic where Niel will announce her attacks through RP quotes. Players would have to memorize each of these quotes and adjust accordingly to the predicted mechanic. Another difficult mechanic would prove to be Heaven's Fall, a knockback proximity raid-wide AoE, followed by a set of AoEs and splash damage within a pie-sliced arena. Exiflare is a mechanic in the last phase that involves 3 sets of moving AoEs which require precise movement to dodge. At the time of release, if a player was hit by an Exiflare explosion, they would die and lose the Phoenix Blessing buff that is acquired in the phase transition, which is a buff that doubles the damage dealt to the boss. This means that the DPS check would be virtually impossible to meet, as the DPS and mitigation check on the last phase were very tight, and the party would more than likely wipe to an enrage. Nowadays though, due to the release of new expansions, the stat squish made the DPS check pretty easy. Nevertheless, these mechanics are very deadly and require precise teamwork and coordination in order to pull off. Before UCOB, the main hindrance of raid progression was the gear check. Savages that were released prior to this fight had high gear checks that prevented players from clearing, even if they knew the mechanics. For example, the Gordius raid tier, which was the first raid tier of Heaven's Ward, absolutely demolished the raiding scene, as both Living Liquid and the Manipulator requires heavy DPS checks that were almost impossible to meet on the first week of progression. To put it into perspective, it took more than a month of progression to see a world first clear on the Gordius raid tier, whereas the most recent tier, Arcadium, was completed in less than a week. I mean, you can just hear how happy they are to have finally cleared the tier. Many teams abused exploits to beat the Manipulator. This, combined with the long period of time between the release of the next raid tier, almost completely killed the raiding scene. When UCOB was released, the difficulty was not simply a gear problem, it was a mechanic problem. Each mechanic would take hours, if not a day or 2 of progression, due to the fact that the fight resets back to the very beginning after a wipe. There are no checkpoints along the way, meaning that if you wipe to a new mechanic 12 minutes into the fight, you would have to play again and complete all the previous mechanics successfully, which can take 3+ pulls before you can even see that mechanic again. Twintania as a phase was not too bad compared to the rest of the fight. Players did not struggle in this phase much as expected of the phase 1 to a fight. That being said though, it was not at all a cakewalk. Twister was the main cause of issues during this phase, which was a mechanic where Twintania would place small tornadoes on the players and they must move away at the end of the cast. If a player was hit by them, it would result in instant death and knock back any close players into the death wall. Niel was a much harder phase with the aforementioned mechanics like Quotes and Heaven's Fall. When moving into Niel, it was definitely a surprise for World Prog to see random RP quotes be incorporated as a mechanic of the fight. When having done this mechanic hundreds of times, it becomes easy since the quotes are practically ingrained into your brain, but doing this for the first time was a nightmare. Luckily though, a certain tracker could help players identify the quotes to their respective related mechanics. Bahamut Prime uses mechanics from previous phases, tweaks them a little bit, and combines them together. The most notable of the bunch is Heaven's Fall Trio, which is a combination of Twister, Giga Flare, which was a raid-wide with very high damage, and Heaven's Fall, which in this case would spawn 8 towers on the edge of the arena, and players would have to be knocked back into each tower to soak them. To give an idea of how difficult the fight was up to this point, 6 days into the ultimate saw barely any streams progging through Bahamut Prime. Of course, the teams aspiring to obtain World First did not stream their prog, meaning that realistically speaking, the World's First would be ahead of what was commonly streamed. Skipping the ads phase, we now arrive at Golden Bahamut. Now, Golden Bahamut's mechanics were not terribly difficult. However, the gameplay needed to push through this phase to reach the end demanded perfect accuracy with no mistakes. Remember that failing here means that the raid would have to be sent back to second 0 of the fight. This last stretch really piles on pressure from the previous phases, and while Exaflare isn't the hardest mechanic in the world to dodge, one mistake and it would be all over. Playing under pressure like that proved to be immensely difficult. Nevertheless, we move forward. Some notable differences between the World First group strats and the rest are as follows. During the transition from Phase 2 to Phase 3, that is from Niall to Bahamut Prime, the group performed a tank LB3, but the LB bar immediately builds up from 0 to full again. This seems to be the result of AoE healing on critical HP targets, causing an increase of the limit break bar by a massive amount every time. It appears that the healers in the group specifically timed their heals so that the group members wouldn't die to the raid-wide damage, but would fall back into critical HP range. This essentially gave them a free cast of tank LB3. Another noticeable difference is their method of dodging Exaflare. The most common method, and probably easiest way to dodge Exaflare, is by positioning yourself near a wall standing next to an Exaflare arrow. Wait for the arrow to disappear and then move inside it. It's a safe and reliable method since you're reacting to the disappearance of the first arrow, which gives you more time to prepare for the next few explosions. The World's First performed a similar but different strategy. Instead of the wall, they set up right next to an Exaflare indicator and dodge inwards towards the explosion as soon as the beginning of the explosion animation is casted. This is riskier than the other strat I've mentioned since the timing is pretty tight. UCOB was really the catalyst for attention to be brought to the FF14 raiding scene, much more than previous raids, with the relevant Reddit thread being the highest rated thread of all time up to that point. Many streamers also streamed their runs, with the Bald Warrior Man peaking at over 7,000 concurrent viewers, a feat which was basically unheard of at that time since before then, even the biggest FF14 streamers would average below 1,000 views. Teams that go for World First clears do not stream their prog as strats would be leaked, and other teams would be able to watch the VOD to learn mechanics. There is no real solution to this, and UCOB was no different. It was not streamed, but the video of the World First clear came out shortly after the clear itself on the same day. With UCOB cleared, we can move on to the second ultimate of the game, Uwu, the Weapons Refrain. The Weapons Refrain was released in patch 4.31 of Stormblood and consisted of 5 phases. Phase 1 to 3 had players prevail against the Realm Reborn Primals, Garuda, Ifrit, and Titan in succession. Afterwards, La Habrea would appear and commence Phase 4, and then finally the ultimate weapon for Phase 5. Overall, the fight lasts about 20 minutes. The world's first clear was done by Team Entropy on the 10th of June 2018, 5 days after its release. This ultimate fight is quite tricky due to the buff Beyond Limits. If a player with this buff performs an LB3, the limit break will immediately fill back up to full. This becomes essential in Phase 4 of the fight La Habrea, where 1 healer, 1 caster, and 1 melee must have this buff, otherwise the group will wipe. However, before talking about Phase 4, I'll explain how to get the buff in the first place, and the non-linearity of the world's first progression as a result of this mechanic. The mechanics of the first 3 phases, that is, the primals, must be resolved in a specific manner in order for the boss to gain a stack of Etherically Charged. At 4 stacks, the primal will become awakened and will gain new moves while changing how their old moves function. Killing an awakened primal will drop a Pillar of Light on the arena, which will bless the player that steps into it the Beyond Limits buff. For Garuda, she will spawn 1 Spiny Plume and 4 Saturn Plumes. The 4 Saturn Plumes should be killed immediately, then a designated player should pick up the 1 Spiny Plume, because whoever first attacks the Spiny Plume will be tethered to it. The spiny plume will give the tethered player stacks of thermal low, and the player must pick up 2 stacks of thermal low before the party kills the spiny plume, because after it is killed, Garuda will cast Giga Storm, which leaves behind a puddle that cleanses thermal low. Cleansing 2 stacks of thermal low will give Garuda 1 stack of etherically charged. For Ifrit, his etherically charged stacks are tied to his Infernal Nail and Eruption mechanic. At some point in the fight, he will spawn 4 Infernal Nail adds and cast Eruption, which is a telegraph that targets the furthest DPS. If an Infernal Nail is hit by Eruption, it will gain a stack of vulnerability down, and if an Infernal Nail is killed with 2 stacks of vulnerability down, Ifrit will gain an etherically charged stack. And finally for Titan, his awakening is tied to his Granite Jail mechanic, which is also the first hard wall of the ultimate for most players. This mechanic will capture 3 players and encase them in Granite Jails where they can't move. These jails detonate through either a bomb boulder, which is an exploding rock AoE that Titan throws out, or the detonation of another jail. When a jail detonates, it leaves behind a circular puddle that will instant kill any players in it, but if Titan is within the puddle, he will gain 1 etherically charged stack. Going back to La Habrea in phase 4, he opens by spawning 6 Magitech bits, which begin to self-destruct, causing the party to wipe. This is where the Beyond Limit buffs come into play, because only a caster LB3 can kill these adds in time to prevent the party wipe. Afterwards, La Habrea casts Blight, dealing massive raid-wide damage and inflicting the Doom debuff. This debuff cannot be cured by any means outside of healer LB3. Doom was the first major roadblock in the race towards first, as approximately after 10 hours of progging, raiders realized the only way to survive Doom was to awaken each primal. Finally, after Doom, La Habrea begins to cast Dark 4, which insta-kills the raid. This must be dealt with by killing him with a melee LB3. And so, all 3 Beyond Limit buffs are used, and the fight can progress. Due to the unclear circumstances of the fight with the Beyond Limit buffs, the progression of the fight would be unstable until the puzzle was solved a few days into the prog, where players would end up at Ultimate Weapon. Ultimate Weapon itself was not an easy phase, with arguably the hardest mechanic in the fight, Ultimate Suppression, being a rapid fire of mechanics. A combination of previous mechanics from all 3 primals will appear, including Ifrit's Eruption, Garuda's Minstrel Song, and Titan's Granite Jail. Afterwards, Ultimate itself will cast 2 Line Telegraph AoEs. This is repeated 3 times, each of which will have different skills from each of the primals, but the lasers will remain the same. Once successfully completed, this leads into a DPS check for the Enrage. This fight is a special case, as when it was first released, it was absolutely magical. The Awakening mechanic made progression an absolute blast, as players would reach La Habrea and not realize that they made the fight impossible as early as phase 1 of the fight. Furthermore, in phase 5, Ultimate Weapon, you were required to maintain some of the thermal low stacks from Garuda in phase 1 to pass certain mechanics. This fight was designed intricately in a way that many phases have mechanics that are required to get past each other. A difficult fight as it is, it's evident that the world's top raiders were more prepared for what was to come this time compared to the bombshell that was UCOB. Indicated by the completion of 5 days, it's fair to say that FF14's raiding scene would be prepared for future ultimates. The Epic of Alexander, or T, was an ultimate that was released in patch 5.11 of Shadowbringers based on the Heavensward Alexander raid tiers. It was cleared by thoughts per second, more commonly known as TPS, a measly 3 days after its release on the 16th of November 2019, 6:26 PM. Surprisingly enough, pushing towards the end of their mental clarity, they managed to clear the fight right before they were going to call it for the night. This clear was by far the furthest a team had been up to at this point, as the second clear took place a whole 3.5 days later by Team Moof on November 20th, 7:18 AM. Oddly enough, Moof's progression was live streamed on Twitch by one of their members, Crystal Azure, or Stull on Twitch. There was actually quite a bit of miscommunication and misinformation on websites which tracked world first clears, as some put down the group's name as Elysium due to the fact that TPS had 3 Elysium members. However, on the Mock Talk podcast, the members stated that their name on the sign-up sheet was Radiance. Radiance was an FC that TPS members wanted to create at the time, but had not much support around it yet. By their accounts, T was the hardest ultimate to proc up to date. This is due to the fact that this fight, more than any of the previous ultimates, had a lot of mechanics where if one player is dead, the party would wipe. In previous fights, a death or 2 would make it hard for the DPS check, but can still be cleared. In T, mechanics were designed such that all 8 players had to be alive. Like the Weapons Refrain, the centerpiece of the fight was a puzzle, namely the Enigma Codex. The Enigma Codex is a buff given in Phase 3 of the fight Alexander Prime. To get a full grasp of this mechanic, we have to understand how this phase is structured. Alexander Prime will go untargetable for sections of the fight where players will have to handle mechanics made up of formations from the bosses in other phases. The important one to focus on at the moment is Formation 2 with the mechanics Judgment Crystal and True Heart. The first piece, Judgment Crystal, will mark random players and will drop crystals where they are standing. The crystals will explode if they overlap, are near Alexander, or are touched by True Heart. When they explode, they deal proximity damage. The second piece, True Heart, will spawn a cat ad across from Alexander, which will in turn summon True Heart. This is an ad that moves towards Alexander. This True Heart ad must touch all 4 crystals, which will turn the heart into a golden color and buff the players with the Enigma Codex buff. This buff is required for the last phase of the fight, Perfect Alexander, for its Fate Projection mechanic. Fate Projection creates clones of all party members and will show what mechanics will be presented when Fate Calibration finishes casting. Fate Calibration comes in 2 forms, A and B, both of which are a set of completely different mechanics, especially B, which proved to be one of the most difficult parts of the fight. Players will be able to identify which Fate Calibration mechanic to do depending on the arrow that the clones point to them. The key part is that players will only be able to see the clones if they have the Enigma Codex buff from Phase 3. TPS figured out this mechanic after a day of experimentation and almost immediately completed the fight shortly afterwards. That being said, the fight was difficult not only because of the puzzle that was Enigma Codex, but also because of mechanics like Limit Cut and the entirety of Phase 2 Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser, or shortened to BJCC. BJCC in particular was very difficult to prog because it is essentially 2 fights occurring at the same time with an additional mechanic of debuff transfers. The 2 bosses Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser had their own separate mechanics, and the final Decree Nisi was a set of 4 debuffs that was applied on either the support or the DPS that inflict minor damage over time. Contacting another player would cause them to acquire the same debuff. Players needed to pass these debuffs back and forth to satisfy the verdict condition on its gavel mechanic, which basically checks that all players have the correct Nisi debuffs. If not done correctly, the party will instantly wipe. Positioning becomes absolutely essential in this phase due to the Nisi mechanic. Progression before Phase 3's first formation, Temporal Stasis, was actually pretty level across the world. TPS stated that the raiding streams weren't too far behind in terms of mechanic than them, and that they even learned about the existence of J-Kick, a massive raid-wide damage right after Limit Cut by a Rises stream. A notable mention is that TPS managed to hit prog points with absolute consistency at the start of the fight. For 7 to 8 pulls in a row, they would complete all the mechanics correctly until the prog point, which allowed them to test new strategies and ideas almost every pull. At Temporal Stasis, TPS gained a considerable lead due to a diagram drawn by Kyo, one of the members, that easily and consistently solved the mechanic 100% of the time. The major roadblock in terms of their progression was Phase 3's third formation, Wormhole, which reintroduces many mechanics from previous phases that must be handled at the same time, such as Limit Cut, Super Jump, and Apocalyptic Ray. Wormhole was so difficult because of the randomness of it. There could be 30 pulls in which players would think they have figured out the mechanic, but on the 31st pull there would be a pattern never seen before. The accuracy of player movement to bait the correct attacks is pivotal, and a singular mistake would cause a wipe. This mechanic was so hard to the point that many of the TPS players considered it the most difficult mechanic in the game in terms of execution up to that point. The 3-day clear was absolutely impressive, and TPS was widely considered to be far ahead of any other group in the world at that point. However, this fight was the catalyst of a problem within the world race raiding scene. Though not rearing its ugly head yet, it would grow to become a massive controversy in the next 2 fights. The Dragon Song's Reprise or DSR was released along 2 years after T, in patch 6.11 of Endwalker. The group that cleared this goes by the name of Neverland, and they had cleared it 6 days and 2 hours after the fight's release on the 2nd of May 2022. It took them around 750 pulls to clear. This fight was brutal. It was by far the hardest ultimate ever made and is on a completely different scale than the previous ultimates. To give some pointers, the damage down given in this fight lasts for 3 minutes, decreasing the damage dealt to the boss by 50%. This alone is already tough, as any mistakes would cut the raid's DPS down by a huge amount, making the DPS checks really hard. The whole fight consists of 8 phases compared to the previous 4 to 5, though there is a checkpoint after the first phase that's still 7 whole phases to push through after every wipe. The difficulty was really the whole fight. Not a single phase was particularly easy, but notable mentions must be awarded to Phase 3 Nidhogg and Phase 5 Dark King Thornton. And unlike the other ultimates, the final phase, Dragon King Thornton, was not at all easier in terms of mechanics like the other ultimates had been. Phase 3 Nidhogg is unique because Nidhogg himself cannot be moved, but will turn to face the highest end midi player if not casting an action. This becomes important for orienting some mechanics. The wall in this phase was Dive from Grace. Each player would be marked with a specific number over their heads ranging from 1 to 3. 3 players would be marked with 1, 2 players with 2, and the remaining with 3. These are completely random. These debuffs indicate what order Nidhogg clones will dive on them, and spawn a tower. Players who are caught in other clone dives will be knocked back and instantly die. This phase was very difficult to prog, even though Nidhogg's individual mechanics were not too hard to grasp. Just knowing how each part works doesn't really help with the fight because they're done at the same time. Players still needed to learn how to do all the jumps at the same time, go in and out and do the stacks at the same time, and Narlock, one of Neverland's healers, stated that no amount of data mining could help prepare for that phase. Moving on to Phase 5, Dark King Thornton, the main problem for most players is movement and positioning, namely Death of the Heavens, which has too much to talk about since this is not a guide video, but is a screenshot of the wiki. Just know that this mechanic is nuts and that positioning and movement were quintessential. Neverland got to Enrage in 5 days and knew they were going to kill it the next time they got there. Originally they were going to rest for 7 to 8 hours before attempting again, but upon getting to 0.2%, they decided to keep going for 2 to 3 more hours before calling it and getting a 5-hour power nap and then finally clearing. Going back to T for a moment, this is where an issue starts to arise. That being in TPS's world first video of their T clear, it was very evident that they had third-party software to handle the placement of markers in different sections of the fight, or auto markers if you will. FF14 has a strong policy against third-party software, and of course this is not allowed. However, despite this, FF14's team congratulated TPS for world's first clear, and all was well. From the release of T to DSR however, the player base changed drastically in that the player count grew immensely and became a lot more mainstream, with players from other MMOs like WoW and other games in general coming over to play. This made the Ultimate explode in terms of attention, even compared to other Ultimate raids. This can be attributed to the never before seen difficulty and the plot of the fight itself. I know, it's kind of odd for a fight to have an inner plot, but it does, with one of the community's most beloved characters, Haurchefant, in an Ultimate timeline surviving the Dragonsong War. It's also notable that during Shadowbringers and going into Endwalker, FF14 was at the peak of its hype, with the highest rated MMO story ever with Shadowbringers, and Endwalker reaching the end of a 10-year saga. While on the other hand, WoW at the same time, the biggest competitor in the MMO scene, was in the Shadowlands expansion, which left a lot to be desired. Players that came from WoW are used to having third-party programs because that's the expected norm in their player base. However, Final Fantasy XIV's community is the polar opposite. Using third-party tools like a certain tracker was publicly stated to be a bannable offense. In Neverland's original World First Clear video, they had been using third-party tools to help them clear, like a tool that allowed them to see when they could slide cast. While this isn't the first time this had happened, remember that TPS cleared T using auto markers too. Square Enix and Yoshida never punished their usage, and even congratulated them on World First as previously mentioned. However, this time was different. Due to the influx of players, SE now had more responsibility than ever to appeal to their policy. So SE directly hit Neverland's clear with a copyright strike, and Yoshida himself stated that if their recognition of World First clears would encourage the players to use third-party tools, then they would no longer recognize the World First clears. The usage of third-party tools once again for a World First clear made people harass and send death threats to Neverland, and some people also shit on TPS for not getting Worlds First. It's also worth mentioning that a large portion of the hate came from the Japanese community, who had a greater sentiment of anti-cheating than the Western player base. Keep this in mind. 2 of the players in Neverland ended up being temporarily banned, and mass reporting of a streamer using mods would also be temporarily banned. Square Enix was out for blood. The Omega Protocol is, as the time of recording, the most recent ultimate to have released in patch 6.31 of Endwalker. Like DSR, this fight was insanely hard. The difficulty of the first 3 ultimates, UCOB, Uwu and T, waned in comparison to the Titan that was top. The 6th phase fight saw many difficulties in its 2nd phase, Omega M and Omega F, and its 5th phase, Dynamis Omega M and Omega F. Phase 2 saw the first wall in the fight, Party Synergy. Party Synergy gives all players a debuff of either mid-glitch or remote glitch, which randomly tethers pairs of players together. The players must space themselves a certain distance from each other, depending on the debuff. Mid-glitch requires the players to be spaced around half the size of the arena, and remote glitch requires a full stretch, the length of the diameter of the arena. Afterwards, all players will be given a marker like PlayStation controller face buttons. Several clones of Omega M and Omega F will spawn, which will cast AoEs that players have to dodge. The AoEs range from being a donut, point blank, middle safe, and cardinal cleaves depending on if the clones have a shield, sword, bladed legs, or a staff. Afterwards, a large eye will appear at the edge of the arena, which will perform a massive line AoE through the center of the arena, requiring the party to split into light parties. Each player will be hit with Optimized Fire 3, a large circle spread AoE. At the same time, the players are required to keep the distance specified by the glitch debuff. After Optimized Fire 3 is resolved, 2 random players will then be given a stack marker, while Omega F casts Discharge, a knockback from the center of the arena. 5 clones to the edge of the arena will cast a point blank AoE, leaving 3 small safe spots that are perpendicular to each other. Players need to get knocked back into these safe spots while also satisfying the glitch debuff. Phew, okay, that was a lot for one mechanic. There are strats available now that highlight the positioning, but it's still a ridiculously difficult mechanic even with it, more so when blind progging. Phase 5 was another wall of the fight, and without a doubt the hardest part of the fight. In fact, the fight was so hard the way it was designed made Zeno, Final Fantasy XIV's biggest creator, state that top will not be clearable in Party Finder without third-party tools used at this phase. Whether or not this has been true, who knows. This phase contains so many things to explain that I won't go into the details, but you can get an idea of how hard it is when looking at Tessen Twintail's top guide, the length for phase 5 compared to the length for any other part of the fight. As much as I would love to provide a rough timeline of how World Prog went, unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any information on it. Though there seemed to have been a mock talk episode for the World First top clear, it has now been removed because the title of the World's First goes to an undecided tie between Neverland, the team which claimed World's First for DSR, and a group called Unnamed. There's a whole lot of things to unpack here, so sit tight. The first completion of the Ultimate was done by Unnamed on the 31st of January 2023, 6 days and 8 hours after the raid's release. They officially announced their win, went into the game's most populated city while AFK with their unique new Ultimate weapons, and went to sleep. Hold on, what's this?
うわ、背面絶対立たないで。
グリッチミドルだ。
俺にビームくれ、俺にビームくれ。
This isn't the Final Fantasy XIV that I know. A channel named Tenbatsu, or Divine Punishment in English, uploaded a video of Unnamed World First POV while they were sleeping. Yep, that's right, a World's First title was once again claimed by seemingly a group which were using third-party tools to assist them. As you can imagine, the community was outraged. Remember that the majority of hate that was targeted towards TPS and Neverland for their World Firsts was by the Japanese community. Ironically enough, Unnamed was a Japanese group. Memes upon memes were spawned upon revelation of this fact, and the community outrage reached levels never seen prior. One of the members in Unnamed ended up deleting their characters in the face of community backlash, but the fans cared little for this. Funnily enough, the person who deleted their character wasn't even part of the top World First Clear team, but part of a previous Savage World First Clear. Eventually, SE and Yoshida himself had to respond, stating that he had warned the community before of using third-party mods to cheat and that they would be punished. He further added that he did not recognize Unnamed's clear as World's First. The GMs of the game informed the members that their Alpha Legend title and achievement for clearing top would be revoked, and also asked them to throw away their weapons that they received as a reward for completing the raid. Neverland, the team that technically cleared the fight second in the world, denied the World's First title as they believed that they didn't deserve it. Narlock's top clear video on YouTube has the description, "I do not feel that this clear was first place and will not acknowledge that it is, so the title is up in the air." FF Logs shows that Neverland was world's first, but since they denied it, it's really hard to say. The fact of the matter is, as long as the race towards first is a thing, which it always will be, the first, second, and so on clears will always be completed with third-party tools. As of the time of recording, the next ultimate announced is Through, which will be a raid based on the Shadowbringers Eden raid tier. I didn't have the chance to watch the previous ultimate races, so hopefully this time I will, and will be able to give a better roadmap of World Prog if I decide to make a video on it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and take care.